My name is Sudha David-Wilp, and on behalf of GMF, I'd like to welcome all of you that are logged on to today's book talk. And before we get started, I'd also like to thank members of our Business Alliance for support of today's programming. Today, we're really pleased to have Stanley Greenberg with us to talk about his new book. Stanley is a renowned political strategist and also a best-selling author. And the book we're here to talk about is RIP GOP, How the New America is Dooming the Republicans. Stanley Greenberg is CEO of Greenberg Research and co-founder of Democracy Corp. He advises presidents, prime ministers, and CEOs across the globe. He was the senior pollster for President Clinton and Vice President Al Gore, as well as British Prime Minister Tony Blair and President Nelson Mandela. Stanley has researched and wrote on disruptive changes in the United States, Great Britain, Europe, South Africa, and Venezuela, and as an expert on party politics. He is also the co-author of It's the Middle Class Stupid, which was published in 2019. Welcome, Stan. Thanks for being with us today.
Glad we were doing this. Thank you.
Yes. So what I'm going to do is just spend a few minutes talking about your book and other things. And I encourage everybody that's on to send questions my way through the Q&A box. And I will feed those questions to Stan. We've got about 45 minutes for our discussion. So I guess we should start off, Stan, by just, tell me your impression about the political conventions, the Democrats and the Republicans. What are your thoughts?
I think they kind of locked in trends that were in the country. I mean, it's been a formative 4 years of the Trump presidency, in which attitudes have been very polarized, very intense. The trends amongst women and a whole range of other things that have only been reinforced by all this. Biden's convention kind of ended the primary. It was very unusual because they didn't really, because of the pandemic, they didn't really end the primary. And so the selection of his vice president, the Sanders endorsement at the convention kind of like ended the primary. And that's when we saw the consolidation of Democrats. And it wasn't happening before. The Democrats were a pretty fractured party. But the lead up and the convention consolidated the Democrats and put them in a strong position, and they moved into further lead with that. The Republican convention made no attempt to reach new voters. It simply reinforced the trends that Trump has tried to govern on. It's led him with a smaller and smaller coalition. And I would have said, if we had not been blocked by technology last week, I would have said before the convention that that nothing was going to happen. That our research on the two conventions and speeches show that his speech actually was pretty unimpactful, and in some ways further narrowed and may even backfire.
Okay. And so let's maybe get into your book, because that talks about sort of deeper trends in the U.S. And then maybe we can flip back to the ground game and the race for November. But I mean, your book talks a lot about this concept of a new America. Can you take a few minutes to describe what the new America is?
Yes. I mean, there's around progressive values. Actually, if you go back to America's history, particularly since World War II, there were a whole series of points in which social movements pushed toward certain kinds of changes, toward modernizing America, and at each point the two parties made decisions about who they would represent. That came, civil rights was the most important, coming to terms with America's black-white history. Then you came to a head on immigration and America as a country with a increasingly foreign-born population. Then the rights of women and what role women would play in society. And at each point, the Republican Party made decisions that led it to, represent older, white, religiously observant, white voters. But because of the South and the rural areas, because of our federal system, because of all of that, they were able to be a sustainable party but not one that could deal with growing trends. Because unlike Europe, every trend we're talking about, America's diversity, the growth of millennial population, and diversity of millennials and Gen Z, all those are accelerating trends. I mean, they're pretty stagnant. I mean, I work in Britain. If you look at those trends, age trends, you're not getting the displacement of older voters by younger voters. It's very slow, like in Britain. Not true in the U.S. You'll go from a millennial population that was 25% in 2016 to 35% in this election, and will be 45% in the next election. And so that's so rapid, and it's so diverse. And so, that's the heart of the new America, though, because the Republican Party fought the rights of women, fought against the modern working family, fought against sexual revolution. Now, what's also happened is that the coalition, the Democratic coalition that was, more racially based, also began to use, women, and particularly college-educated women and suburban women, became also part of that coalition that was, opposed to a Republican Party that was a Southern white male older party.
So basically, the new America you see emerging, is composed of sort of this millennial vote and women, right? Those are sort of the big constituents that the Democrats are leaning on right now. But it wasn't enough in 2016, and the Republicans were able to win with the shrinking demographic that you talk about. But maybe talking about partisanship in the United States in general. I mean, there's been polarization throughout the United States. Mm-hmm. And in your book, if I'm not mistaken, you sort of talk about how it really emerged during the Clinton administration and the culture wars. Is that when sort of the Republican Party decided, okay, we're going to go for this demographic that believes in, that's pro-life and get the evangelical vote? Is that when it happened, or did it happen later?
That's an important piece of it, because what happened when first of all, Democrats are mostly reacting to what the Republicans are doing. So Republicans, increasingly immigration is the dominant, is like black-white, black-white history is obviously consumes, almost everything, and is still consuming things, during the pandemic. And the first real battle for the modern parties was civil rights, and it was Republicans actually who had a more pro-civil rights record, and it produced a realignment of the parties on civil rights. But immigration increasingly became the dominant piece within the Republican Party, and the Republican Party is now an anti-immigrant party in a country that is increasingly foreign-born and immigrant country. And the battles took place, first in the states. California, led the way with Wilson, Governor Wilson, and the referendum there to exclude immigrants from getting state benefits. Other governors took up that model, and so it went from the grassroots within the Republican Party against immigrants. Democrats were reacting against it, but Bill Clinton, you're right on this point. There was a point at which Bill Clinton said, you know what? We are a multicultural country. We're an immigrant country. It's our strength. And their fight forced Democrats to say, that, racial equality was a driving part of it. Equality for women was a driving part. But what was happening within the Republican Party on immigration, led Bill Clinton to say, embrace us being a multicultural country and party. But then you had the real acceleration and polarization came with the election of Barack Obama, the first black, president. And that just, if you look at the measures on racial resentment and how much that rose, but also how much it became a central driver of voting Republican. And so if you look at the reaction against the Tea Party movement, social movement, and battle against Obama, the Tea Party wave election, and my book really argues is really from 2010, that decade, and that Donald Trump is really leads a Tea Party, Republican Party, And that's the essence, of his philosophy. There is a philosophy, but he dominates that party as a Tea Party, and he's driven, more and more voters away, pretty dramatically,
Right.
and that's why we're in a different situation in 2020 than we were in 16.
Absolutely. And I mean, that's something that you point out in your book too, because I think a lot of people, especially here in Europe, think about Donald Trump as sort of an aberration, but you talk about Pat Buchanan and how he sort of laid the groundwork for this ideology. And it seems like President Trump sort of took the playbook and put it on steroids with the help of Fox News. I mean, tell us a little bit about the Pat Buchanan platform and how it relates to today with President Trump and the.
It's really interesting you highlight it because you had a Republican Party actually that was divided between the GOP establishment, which, by the way, was pro-immigration. So if you look at the governors, Reagan and Bush, who came out of California and Texas, and they wanted to compete for the Hispanic vote. And they supported comprehensive immigration, made major immigration reforms, bipartisan, under their presidencies, both Reagan and the first Bush, and the second Bush, wanted to move ahead with immigration reform, but they were opposed within their own party by the Buchanans, by the nationalist, forces, and they were, when Trump ran in 16, they were about half the party, and I think people, don't understand how insecure his hold was on his own party. That's why I believe he was not going to reach out, to more centrist voters, because he built a coalition that was Tea Party, evangelical. Tea Party is the strongest nationalist, anti-immigrant. Those are the Buchanan voters. So he immediately, that's what he won in the primaries first. The Tea Party Republican base voters. He made an strong alliance with the evangelicals, and with some nationalist Catholics, America First Catholics. He was able to have about 56% of Republicans voted for him, in that first election. But no GOP establishment figure spoke at the convention. Did not have the sort of any of the Republican presidents. So he had a very insecure hold on his own party, and he governed for the Tea Party, and which is very anti-immigrant, very nationalist, very Buchanan mold. And also locked in the evangelical vote, but his narrow hold over his own party, meant that he became more and more extreme as president.
Right, and and I did point. There's a statistic that I wrote down in your book. You say how today secular conservatives and moderates make up approximately 40% of the Republican Party. So what do you think is going to happen to those people? Do you think there will be a new realignment? Will they split, or will they try to reform from the outside, like the Lincoln Project and these never Trumpers? Where do you see those people going?
Yeah, that's really interesting. By the way, that block is down to about 35%. At the time I wrote the book, they were 40%. What's happening, that the Republican Party is a diminished party. The smaller and smaller who identify with the Republican Party. And so when we ask in our polls now, we've added a question on whether in the last few years you used to be a Republican. We have 18% of the electorate who describe themselves as that I used to be a Republican, and so this is a imploding party. And so the critical question is what happens now with them. And by the way, I've been really surprised how fast that they've pulled off and also stopped voting for them. And if you look in the primaries in Virginia, Northern Virginia, if you look at Michigan, you had like really Republican towns, and suddenly had this surge of people voting in the Democratic primary. And they pulled away from the party and began voting in the Democratic primary to try to pick, who the nominee would be against Bush, and we have, I think, about a third who identify as Democrats, but they're all over the place. We don't know, whether they can get them back. I watched what happened to the Democratic Party with Ronald Reagan in 1980 and 84, and 84 was one of the biggest landslides, against a modern party, And you then had the Democrats who then went through, in some ways, 84, they were split between the modernizers, Gary Hart, very close in the primaries. In 88, you had Dukakis, but you had modernizers in the primary. 92, and I worked for Bill Clinton in 92. The modernizers finally won in 92, but we went through 3 or 4 elections in which we were fighting over what the party was about. And so I think they're going to have an internal fight. Their problem will be that I don't think Trump will go away. I mean, he's going to try, to dominate the party. But if you look at Gary Hart and if you look at Bill Clinton, they really changed who were Democrats. And the people began, registering as Democrats because they were attracted by the candidates that were emerging there, and the nature of the party really changed. The demographic composition of the party, dramatically changed. And the primaries, are battles that bring people in, and so they're going to go for the primaries, and I'm sure they'll draw people in. The biggest problem, and what I suggest in the book, is immigration. Yeah. I mean, immigration is like civil rights. Okay, the percentage foreign-born is now under Trump never been bigger. Doesn't matter if he's tried to stop immigration. America is an immigrant country. If you look at the attitudes under Trump, there's been this dramatic rise in numbers of people who think immigration benefits the country, in reaction to Trump, because it's forced Americans to think about who we are. And we've gone from about 50% of the country when Trump first came in, believing immigrants benefit the country, to 65%. It's like an astonishing number. And the more he tries to build walls, the more Americans accept immigration. The vote is a pro-immigration vote. I mean, it's pro-women, it's pro-immigration.
Yeah.
And I believe Democrats are going to move, given the scale of win, because I think they'll win the Senate. One of the first things they will pass will be comprehensive immigration reform.
That's interesting that you say that, and that's the one thing I like about your book, because you get the impression that maybe you're just going to focus on one party in this book, being a Democratic strategist, why the Democrats have the advantage, but you really talk about how both the parties, the internal structures are changing, and getting back to maybe the Democrats, because you point yourself that in 2016, maybe the Democrats had their blinders on when it came to people thinking about people still suffering economic pain in certain areas of the country, and also immigration being not necessarily an easy topic for Democrats to talk about, because as John, and you mentioned John Judas, who we both know, and how he talked about how Democrats also have to frame the debate carefully along immigration. So how are Democrats going to talk about this? Because if I'm not mistaken, and you mentioned too, the racial resentment sort of reached its apex with President Obama. If I'm not mistaken, you have to correct me, but didn't he only get like 39% of the white vote?
Yeah, but Biden will get a majority of the white vote.
He will, but that still doesn't, I mean, what's the tension in the Democratic Party between this so-called new America that you talk about, but then also sort of the traditional voters that we have in mind in the Rust Belt that are, the white working class? How do they go together?
Look, there are so many things going on in the country. Almost everything, against Trump. So the biggest one, when we look at the voter trends, will be the women's tsunami. And so you saw in the midterm elections, you had huge turnout. It's never been a turnout as high as you had in those elections. Democrats, women won their primaries, and then they won the general election. Really changed the composition of the House. If you look at the coverage of what's happening in cities and states, you can see how many women are actually in power in the United States on the Democratic side. The same thing's happening now, and there's even more. If you look at the primaries and the candidates in 2020 in the House, and it's women who are running on the Democratic side. There will be every subgroup so if you look at African Americans, Hispanics, millennials, white millennials, white millennials are like 70% women. The men are like almost like tied, but the women are like a 70%, for Biden. Like, so that like every subgroup, you know, is being, so the gender piece is, and that's the first thing. The Women's March, you know, started it, but it's only growing in every election. And there isn't any group. If you look at African Americans, there's about 15 to 70% of the men, you know, are voting for Trump, but the women are, you know, are off the chart. But it's true of every group across the electorate. But and almost every group, though, the women are bigger. In fact, almost twice as big. If you look at African American women and men in terms of what portion of the vote is, the men are, you know, much bigger. Same thing with millennials. Same thing, you know, with Hispanics. Same trend in every group.
Okay. I mean, I have questions. I mean, there's 2 questions I have already lined up. I'm going to just ask one more and then we'll open it up. But given the fact that you talk about the, you know, the millennial vote and women, et cetera, you would think that that would lend credence to maybe having more of a progressive ticket. But now we have, you know, Vice President Biden and Senator Harris. Is this the right ticket for the moment that we're in?
It's not my history is, it was, I mean, look, the voters, Democratic voters were so determined to pick somebody that they viewed as electable. I was for Elizabeth Warren.
Right.
Would have been my preference, both as president and as vice president. But you know, I watched when they decided after South Carolina that Biden could beat. I mean, they just switched on their own. He didn't have to campaign. He didn't have. The voters made a decision in the last few days before each primary, tactically, who was going to be the candidate that could, you know, beat Trump. And that, you know, I have my own views on, you know, on what should have happened to make the left within the Democratic Party more electable. But it's also, we're also dealing with a moment in time in which, you know, Biden's, you know, plans have become very bold. I mean, like just the pandemic, the economic crisis, as you know, has just, you know, almost doesn't matter if that is anybody coming in. We're gonna have gridlock until the presidential election. I don't believe Trump, you know, will allow an increase in spending. So you're gonna have this stagnant economy and, you know, high unemployment, you know, coming in. They are, you know, Keynesian economists. They believe in, you know, and they believe that the mistake in Obama, obviously in Europe with austerity, was not spending enough. I mean, they believe in spending, and so there'll be this, you know, hopefully they will have total control, you know, federally, and they will increase spending. And if you look at his proposals, you know, on healthcare, on infrastructure, on you know, child care and tax policy, it's way more progressive than Biden ran on. I mean, the moment will force, you know, a very progressive set of policies.
So you talked a lot about these important themes, and there's a question from Jerry Ellman who asks, would you consider this to be the most important election in the United States right now, you know, in comparison to, say, like, is it up to the par with like the Civil War and, you know, Great Depression, or is this an election like that for the United States?
I think it is on the par with the Civil War, and I write that that I believe we have an imploding Republican Party, but this is a Republican Party that, you know, was evangelical, very anti-democratic, anti-secular, anti-democratic party. Has tried to hold on to power by suppressing the vote. It's been able to do that because of its southern, you know, and rural base. And I believe, you know, like the end of the Republican Party, end of the Whigs, you know, before the Civil War, they could no longer address the issues the country was facing. The Republican Party, you know, displaced them. I think we're dealing with an implosion of the Republican Party. They will have a huge internal fight on their future, but also simultaneous with this pandemic and worst economic crisis since the Great Depression, that will lead to a vast expansion of government, you know, playing a role. There's also a new consciousness about inequality across the board on the Democratic side on believing growth. I mean, if you look at Biden's core advisors, they believe that you have to reduce inequality in order to have growth. And then you also have the huge racial disparities and injustice, which have also been brought out by the pandemic, and also created a racial justice agenda. And I think all of those coming together, and hopefully with the Democrats, with a wave election which Democrats have full control, you'll have, and everything will have to happen quickly. And people will believe, there'll be a need to move on reform. I think the filibuster, could go
as an agenda item by the Democrats.
I heard President Obama say that it was part of Jim Crow.
Right.
But I said the rationale is now there.
Well, especially if, like demographic trends show that there's going to be a few states like that have maybe a hold, but very representing a small minority, a small portion of the population. There could be grounds for getting rid of the filibuster. But there's a question from Uwe Wissenbach about, as a German, he's saying he can't understand how the evangelicals or the sort of the religious right in America still stick to President Trump, given the depth of the problems that in the United States with the pandemic, and also the fact that he's not necessarily, your model Christian. Why is that?
I've been doing a lot of, and you'll see in the book, I do a lot of listening to evangelicals in the book, focus groups, and by the way, they're still there with him. There's no evidence that that their support is eroding. They're lock solid for him. I listen to them in groups, and look, they are, and they are concentrated in the South. When you get to the north, you have observant and Midwest, observant Catholics are a bigger part of the Republican Party, but in the South and rural parts of the country, which is the base of the Republican Party, evangelicals, view the secularism and modernization and role for women and modern family as just will wipe out everything they believe. And in most other countries, once you have these battles over abortion, they go away. But because we have this southern and rural base and federal system and system of states that overrepresents those areas, you're able to, these issues stay at the top. I mean, so that you still have, if you look at their challenge to the Affordable Care Act, it was on contraception. I mean, they are still fighting contraception. They're still fighting the sexual revolution. Republicans don't have child care policies. They haven't proposed any because they think that will favor working women over homemakers. I mean, we have a Republican Party that has not accepted the sexual revolution or a modern working family. Every time you have a referendum in Europe, on these issues, you don't go back. I mean, it's settled. It's to have abortion settled or contraception. Not here because you have a continuing base of electoral support that has you on the edge of power. In fact, in power more than not. Given how rigged the system has been, they've lost the popular vote, in all but one election.
Yeah, and that's actually a good way, a segue, because one question from Michael Callengard is Michael McCary. I mean, how is it possible? I mean, we don't know what's going to happen. I mean, you seem pretty confident that this will be another wave election, and you'll see, signs of 2018 at play again. But could it be again if he loses the popular vote? Why does he still have a chance to win the Electoral College the way the map is made up in the United States right now?
Well, it's because they're able to suppress the vote in enough states. If you look at like Florida and Georgia in the midterm elections, Democrats lost them by a few thousand votes. And there isn't any question, and these were with black candidates on the Democratic side, we would have won those states. So there will be states that they will win that they shouldn't. But the fact that Florida and North Carolina and Georgia are close or leaning Biden, or like Florida leaning strongly Biden, just makes it very hard for the same thing to happen on the Electoral College. Also, Democrats, were divided. I mean, the Sanders voters, only 85% of Sanders voted for Hillary Clinton in the end. They voted third party, or not vote. And that was happening until the convention, until the selection of Harris and the convention, and that's when the Democrats consolidated. So right now, we have Democrats getting 95%, for Biden, and Republicans 89% for Trump. So the Democrats are more consolidated. So there's the kind of fragmentation. It was only a few thousand votes, in those three states, Pennsylvania.
So you don't really see a viable path for President Trump with the Electoral College at the moment?
No.
Okay. No. And then given that, and there's a question from Ireland, Andrew from Cork University, if Biden wins and Trump is sort of, leaves the White House, how do you see all this playing out with the disputed election and this question of, voter fraud? Do you anticipate this being a problem?
Sure. I mean, look, if the election is close in any way, I mean, Trump will be hard to dislodge, and he will, because of the absentee ballots and the large number of absentee ballots, there's going to be massive turnout. You had a primary in Massachusetts, 1.6 million people voted. Like nothing like that has happened. Like people are going to vote in such numbers, and so you're gonna have some states like Pennsylvania, which haven't had a tradition of people voting by absentee ballot, and I think took 5 weeks to count the vote in the primaries, are going to be overwhelmed. And if they can delay the process, there'll be states in which it won't be not certain who will pick the electors, just because the count isn't finished. Even though the Democrats may be ahead, they've used that process to model it. I think that'll be very hard to do if Pennsylvania isn't deciding it, but other states like Florida have gone for Biden, that it's going to be hard for him to do that. But the margin has to be very big if it were to close. And right now there's just no evidence of closing after the conventions. It looks like he's got an 8 or 9 point lead. Let's remember that Obama in a landslide won by 5.6%. So this is maybe way beyond that.
Yeah, I mean, I was reading an article yesterday, I think it might have been in Politico, about how people in the Biden campaign are causing people to worried about the Biden vote. They're calling them bedwetters, but you seem very confident that there will be a wave election again, and that he should, coast to victory. But, and if that's the case, I mean,
my view is that in terms of coast, I think they should battle to have big a margin, and I think they believe that, as big a margin as possible, because of you can't allow any mischief. And I do think it's important. I think the Supreme Court, was really interesting in the timing of the decisions that it made, where I think Roberts was sending a signal to the president: this is not your court. You can't count on us if we end up with another Florida, via Gore, contest. The Supreme Court, I think, will be on the side of counting votes and not stalling the process.
So I have a question from a colleague, Matthew, who's asking, do you think the Democrats, given all, again, there's so many issues on the table, it's hard to know where to start, right? But do you see this as being an identity politics election? Are Democrats using that tactic, or are they not? Or is it better to be sort of think of big tent right now?
Well, identity politics may well be a big tent at the moment.
Considering the opposite, or considering the other side. Yeah.
I was critical of the of Hillary, because how much her campaign was group-based, politics, identity politics, when in fact, what our research showed is people were mostly upset about deep economic problems that they face and the corruption that keeps average people from influencing government. And we also found that was more motivating, for blacks and Hispanics and other voters of color. That that they are driven first by economic issues rather than identity issues. Okay. And I think Democrats will run on both, because Biden is, if you look at him, he's much more instinctively running on economic issues, what's happened to middle class and working people. He has a lot of latitude because he came there as Obama's VP with such strong black support. They're the base who got him there. So he has kind of the latitude, to be both. But the Democratic Party has lots of fractures, around economic and identity, politics that will play out afterwards. And you also have, more progressive and moderate, fractures as well.
Yeah, it seems like, the party is just maybe as fragmented as the Republicans, but because of this, desire to get Trump out of office, it's unifying. But in terms of, are there any blinders that you think that Vice President Biden is missing? Is it enough to it's not enough to just talk about getting rid of Trump? I mean, is there something that he's missing in your mind? Because as you point out, it's obviously hindsight's 2020. It's easy to talk about what maybe Hillary Clinton did wrong, but is there something else that you would be able to tell the Biden campaign that they should watch out for? For example, this law and order issue. Is it generating some uptick for President Trump?
It's not, but it's not in part because Biden has been, I think, effectively, addressed it. He's been reassuring and very clear that he condemns the violence, that on the left and any attacks on police. And so he's in his bones, he kind of understands, those issues and is reassured on that. And I don't see any evidence that that piece of it is, is working. Now, my bigger concern is that he won't be bold enough. And I'm saying that not ideologically, but out of what the country is looking for. Mm-hmm. I mean, they are, desperate for on healthcare. They think the healthcare system is failing. They think the pandemic, the coronavirus, is a healthcare crisis. We have a country whose health, particularly older and working class and rural voters, have huge healthcare issues, as we've seen in declining life expectancy. One of the few developed countries, where you have such a thing. But we have so many kind of pre-existing conditions and disabilities that are playing out, that are impacting people, with this pandemic, where you're supposed to, not work. It's hurting working people particularly hard, and they are looking for big changes on, healthcare. Mm. Democrats, underestimated how much of a problem Obamacare, was for them, because working people didn't like it. It was a market system. It had high deductibles. They viewed they were being taxed, and required to buy health insurance that wasn't covering very much. And that was particularly true, of working people. In many parts of the Democratic base, who actually who needed to use it, found it very costly.
Right.
And Trump promised affordable health care, and they believed him, and that's why they punished him in the midterm.
Right.
Elections. And they're looking for big changes in healthcare. And Biden has already proposed.
President Biden and Vice President Harris will have the room to maneuver to make those transformational changes, given there's going to be obviously a lot to rectify, given the crises the country is facing. Will they have the room to be that transformational?
Well, there may be fiscal. I mean, I think their ideology won't. It's not an ideological or political barrier. They have the space, and they are showing. In fact, if you look at what they've already proposed, Biden, lowering the, the Medicare age, to 60, a public option that, that looks like, Medicare, in which people are automatically, and he raised the option that people are automatically enrolled in it. I mean, there's things that would dramatically expand and improve and make healthcare more secure. He's talked about infrastructure on childcare. That's a huge change. I think the moment is creating that, and I don't see any evidence that the Biden team or his mentality is blocking that kind of innovation, government policy innovation. I think there's a lot of space.
Okay, there's two questions that I'm going to consolidate. I mean, I kind of asked you this at the beginning, but I guess there is a lot of fascination about what's going on with the Republican Party. So if Trump loses, do you think the party will, and I guess it needs to be a resounding loss, will the party be ready to do an autopsy and change course? Or do you think this is going to, Trumpism is going to be in the system for a while?
Well, I mean, Trump's going to, well, who knows about Trump? I mean, Trump may face, like, I don't think Biden will do, what Trump has tried to do to his prior, his opponents, his political opponents. So I think Biden will be very averse to, to revisiting impeachment or even corruption, under what happened, with the Trump presidency. But there will be in New York and elsewhere. There's going to be prosecutions, on his finances, and there's going to be prosecutions on what's happened with women. That was building up and have been put on hold until he comes out of office. So he may find himself in a whole series of trials, that reduce his influence within the Republican Party. But he will try to control the Republican, Party. But I think there'll be a real battle. But it'll be hard for a while because he's driven out the moderates. Are the moderates willing to come back?
Right.
And most of them were moderate women, more pro-choice on abortion. There'll probably still be a pro-life, party.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's so much to unpack, Stan. I'm gonna ask the last question if you indulge me, and we'll have to get you to Europe for sure. The original idea was to get you to Europe, but the pandemic kind of made us change plans. But at least we get to see you virtually. But if Vice President Biden wins, is there anybody out of the presidential, his former opponents in the primaries that you would recommend? I think I know the answer to one, that you would recommend that join the cabinet under the administration. And is there a Republican that you think of in a Biden-esque type of way, reaching over to across the aisle, that you think should join the cabinet?
Well, there's a lot of talk about Warren as a potential Treasury Secretary, so I'm pushing for Treasury Secretary. My partner, James Carville, is pushing for her to be Attorney General, because that's the only way that people will believe that people will go to jail, if for what they have done. Particularly on what's happened in the banking and finance sector, but I think that that's one that I would see. I don't know about specific. I think this will be an Obama light administration on foreign policy.
Okay. And yeah, I know a lot of the people that work for the administration are probably going to go back if he wins. And there's one more question from an audience member, and I think it's worth asking. Do you see Vice President Biden as sort of an interim solution? Do you think that the Republicans can come back in 2024, especially, the nature of U.S. politics is a check? Do you see the Republicans coming back, either taking one of the houses of Congress or one of the chambers of Congress, or taking the White House?
Look, there's always, this is going to be the bold, if I'm right about the scale of the election win, this will be the boldest, set of policies that America has, seen, since the New Deal, or during World War II, to respond, you could easily begin with, if the Republicans have not done any aid to state and cities, which is unlikely because they're running a whole campaign that's based against cities. So it's very hard for them to give relief. Well, that's where you're going to have this drop. So you're going to have, probably, massive aid, to state and cities. Also, all of this would be blocked if the filibuster was in place. And so, you then have to block the filibuster. So you're going to have like total control. It is usual to have a pushback against the incumbent,
Right.
president and party in the midterms. I can't believe the Senate wouldn't be close enough. They would, that you would, risk. I'm not sure about the House, but the suburban trends are such, they keep growing. So, so I'm not sure whether they lose, the House, but the Senate. It's hard to believe the Senate would, wouldn't, be close,
Right.
in a pushback. So that look, everything depends on immigration, on the terms of the Republican Party. Now, I know the Democrats will pass, comprehensive immigration reform. It'll be, the first 100 days. It'll nothing. Well, because you can't deal with the dreamers, unless you're dealing with, with that. And there's such a consensus. So now the question is, what happens on the Republican side once that happens? See, I think it's something like what happened, and I write in the book, with welfare reform, when Bill Clinton, passed it. It used to be a consuming issue. Welfare was just everything, in American politics, and it was defining within the Democratic primary, who Bill Clinton ran on welfare reform, but once he did it, it disappeared. Now, will it disappear? Will immigration disappear? Will there be enough? It's like it's a civil rights issue. If they choose to contest immigration on an ongoing basis, then they will. They're not going to come into power. You can't be an anti-immigration party in a country that is so diverse, and every year, in an accelerated way, becomes more diverse. And Democrats will also obviously, greatly expand that. But do they? You have interest within the Republican Party. Where is business? Where is Murdoch? Where is Fox?
Where's Fox? Yeah.
Where are the business interests within the Republican Party?
Right.
On having immigration being not contested. And so I think there'll be tremendous pressure to accept, immigration reform and try to diffuse it as an issue. That will then change what's possible.
Well, we'll be watching here in Europe about what happens in November and thereafter. Stan, great to have you. Thank you so much. Thanks everybody for tuning in. And like I said, Stan, we'll have you come to Berlin so we can do this live when hopefully this pandemic is behind us.
In a wave election around, I'm totally bankrupt.
Okay. Well, and wishing everybody good afternoon, good morning, and to enjoy the rest of your day. Stan, take care. Thanks everybody. Bye-bye. Bye.